Welcome to the deep dive. If you've been paying attention at all lately, you've probably noticed something pretty hard to ignore. There's this massive mental health crisis unfolding, certainly here in the US. So many people feel, well, let down by the current system. They're really searching urgently for new solutions.
That's absolutely right. People are looking everywhere for new approaches, new answers, because, the status quo just isn't cutting it for everyone who needs help.
And that's exactly why we're taking a deep dive today into the, let's say, complex and, yeah, often contentious world of psychedelics for mental health. The big question, is the promise real hope? Or is it maybe just, overblown hype?
hmm Our mission here is really to unpack the current landscape. We're drawing insights from a review of David Nutt's book, Psychedelics, Hope or Hype, and also a recent public debate on this very topic.
Yeah, so the core question we're really grappling with is this. Based on the evidence we have right now, should psychedelics actually be legalized for treating mental health conditions?
It's a huge question, profound implications, and we're going to try and explore both sides pretty rigorously.
Okay, so with that set up, let's get into the promise first. What do these compounds potentially offer? And we have to start with a key figure in this whole uh, psychedelic renaissance, as they call it, David Nutt.
Right, David Nutt. He's a neuropsychopharmacologist over at Imperial College London. And he's been, well, really central to this movement for quite some time now, decades, really.
His vision it's pretty broad, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Nutt believes psychedelics could help with a whole spectrum of conditions. You've got depression, addiction, anxiety, anorexia,
hmm
even things like chronic pain, OCD, end-of-life anxiety.
He even made some bolder claims like they could make you a better artist. That seems a bit
Yeah.
speculative.
Yeah, that one's definitely more out there.
Yeah.
But he shows the breadth of his thinking. And his history is fascinating, too. He was actually the UK government's drugs czar.
Yeah, a top advisor role. But then back in 2009, he got fired
For what, exactly?
for basically presenting data showing that MDMA caused fewer deaths than, believe it or not, horse riding.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. Challenging the political narrative with facts that really sort of set the stage for what he did next.
It definitely seems like a turning point. Because after that, he launched Drug Science.
Right. That organization aimed at disclosing, quote, the truth about drugs free from political or commercial influence.
And they put out that famous table, didn't they? The one rating drug harms.
They did. It rated alcohol as the most dangerous overall and magic mushrooms way down at the safest end. That definitely stirred the pot.
I bet. And he kept pushing. He and Robin Carhart Harris, they established the world's first academic center focused purely on psychedelics at Imperial College.
Which was a huge deal, apparently, after like a 50-year gap in that kind of research in the UK.
And he was involved in Australia's recent move, too, right? Persuading them to legalize psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, reportedly flew over there, presented the case to their regulators. It shows his influence is pretty global now.
So for Nutt, this has clearly been a long, long fight. If the FDA approves these therapies in the U.S.
Which could then make them accessible in the UK through some new reciprocal agreement.
Exactly. That would basically be the culmination of his, 2-decade struggle.
It's quite the story. But speaking of influence and the commercial side, while drug science aims for independence, Nutt himself does have some commercial ties, doesn't he?
That's true, yeah. It's something that comes up. He launched his own alcohol substitute, for example, after ranking alcohol as so risky.
And he's involved with several psychedelic companies, like on advisory boards, receiving fees.
Yes, I believe he's connected to about 4 companies in that way. It definitely raises that tricky question about, the line between scientific advocacy and commercial interest. Is it science or is it partly a sales pitch?
It forces you to think about objectivity, for sure. And related to that, while Nutt often emphasizes that the risks have been, quote, grossly exaggerated, some reviews of his book point out that it maybe doesn't give enough weight to certain dangers, like bad trips, even in controlled settings.
Right, or those more enduring difficulties some people report, like prolonged anxiety or that feeling of derealization, or even HPPD, the hallucinogen persisting perception disorder.
Where people keep seeing visual stuff months or years later.
Exactly. It can last a long time for some. And then there was that recent psilocybin trial where suicidality actually increased for some patients.
And Nutt's response reportedly was that it was probably unrelated to the drug.
Which, critics would say might seem a bit dismissive. It highlights the need for really thorough reporting of all outcomes, good and bad.
It's definitely a complex picture. Okay, so alongside Nutt's advocacy, there was this other massive influence shifting public opinion, right? The pollen effect.
Oh, absolutely. Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, that was huge. It wasn't just reporting on research. It really brought the personal, sometimes mystical experiences to a mainstream audience.
Made it relatable, maybe, beyond just the clinical data.
Exactly. It helped people see past the sort of historical stigma and understand the potential for healing, especially with things like depression and anxiety. It became this cultural touchstone.
And you can really see that reflected in the legal changes happening now.
For sure. Psychedelic therapy is actually legal now in Australia, Oregon, Colorado.
California seems like it's heading that way too.
Right. And even just possessing these substances has been decriminalized in what, like 20 U.S. cities and towns?
So the momentum is definitely there. And what about the FDA, the big regulator here in the U.S.?
Well, they seem to be getting close, at least with MDMA and psilocybin used in psychotherapy. They did review that MDMA application recently.
The one for PTSD.
Yeah. And they didn't approve it outright, but the way it was framed sounded more like a not yet, asking for more data rather than a hard no.
Okay, so maybe a pause, not a full stop.
That seems to be the interpretation. And a really key indicator of how seriously this is being taken now is the money flowing in.
From where?
Big federal agencies. We're talking NIH, the VA, Department of Defense, SAMHS.
Wow, the VA and DoD. That's significant.
It is. Plus, you've got dozens of state-level task forces, universities putting money into it. It's a completely different funding landscape compared to, say, 10 years ago.
Let's drill down on those MDMA trials for PTSD specifically. You mentioned hundreds of people participated.
Yes. Phase 2 and Phase 3 trials. A diverse group to veterans, survivors of assault, different genders, ages, races.
And the results look pretty good, right?
They did report some very promising efficacy. In some studies, something like 67% of participants no longer met the criteria for PTSD after the treatment.
67%, that's huge.
It is. And over half apparently maintained that relief in follow-up studies.
And how did the trials actually work? It's not just taking a pill, is it?
No, not at all. It involves typically 3 main sessions, each lasting up to 8 hours. And during that time, the person interacts with a therapist, and they're given either MDMA or placebo. It's very much therapy-assisted treatment.
Right. The substance is a tool within a larger therapeutic process.
Precisely. And the organization behind a lot of this is MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies.
And they set up a separate company, MAPS PBC, which then became Lykos Therapeutics.
That's right. And MAPS is still a part owner, which again kind of highlights that blurred line we talked about between nonprofit advocacy and the commercial side.
Okay. And another really important signal from the FDA is this breakthrough therapy designation. What exactly does that mean?
It's a big deal in the regulatory world. It means the FDA believes, based on early evidence, that a treatment might offer a substantial improvement over existing therapies for a serious or life-threatening condition.
So it signals they think there's real promise there.
Exactly. It warrants speeding up the development and review process. And several psychedelics have received this: LSD for generalized anxiety disorder,
Psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression.
and MDMA for PTSD, which we were just discussing. It really shows the FDA thinks, okay, there's something here worth looking at closely.
So bringing this back to you, the listener, what does all this mean? Well, it suggests these developments could offer a genuine lifeline for people struggling with conditions that haven't responded to other treatments. It really feels like a moment of, well, hope for many.
But, and there is a but,
Yeah.
we need to look closely at the concerns that temper that hope. While that breakthrough status sounds amazing, that recent FDA decision on MDMA,
Yeah.
we called it a not yet.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is the FDA and its advisory board actually rejected the application, voted against it, and it was reportedly almost unanimous.
Okay, so not yet might be putting a positive spin on what was actually a rejection.
It certainly suggests more significant hurdles than maybe some headlines implied, and it raises serious questions about, the research itself, its integrity, how it was presented.
And one of the fundamental challenges is the placebo problem, right? How do you do a truly blind trial when people usually know if they've taken a psychedelic?
Exactly. It's very difficult. Patients often know if they're tripping, and some studies even suggest that if someone believes they got the real drug, the placebo effect can be incredibly powerful, sometimes almost matching the drug's effect.
That makes it hard to know how much is the drug and how much is expectation.
It really does. And adding to these concerns, there was a report, I think, from the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review that raised flags.
What does it say?
It suggested that in some studies, therapists might have, maybe subtly, encouraged patients to report positive outcomes and perhaps discouraged reporting negative ones.
That points to potential bias in the data collection.
And another review looking at trials for esketamine, which isn't a classic psychedelic but is used similarly for mental health, found that over 40% of adverse effects just weren't reported in the published results.
40% unreported. That's worrying. It undermines trust in the findings.
It definitely underscores the challenge of ensuring complete transparency and impartiality.
And then there's the broader concern about the researchers themselves. Many people involved in psychedelic research, even journal editors, are also, users or strong advocates.
Right. Which inevitably raises questions about potential bias in the scientific process itself. Can you be truly objective when you're also a passionate believer?
It's a fair question, and some critics take it further, suggesting the whole movement has become almost cult-like.
Yeah, you hear that language sometimes, this idea of blind following of key figures. I mean, in any field that promises revolutionary change, you can get a certain level of zealous belief, can't you?
So when people say cult-like, what are they pointing to? Is it just strong enthusiasm or something more specific?
It's probably a mix. It likely refers to intense devotion to certain leaders or ideas, maybe downplaying risks, possibly creating an echo chamber effect. And then, of course, you have the money aspect.
Right, big money.
Huge money. We're talking hundreds of millions, maybe billions, flowing in from, well, all sorts of places. Super rich individuals, reportedly some neoconservative right-wing donors, lots of tech bros.
Which naturally makes some people skeptical. Is this about healing, or is it becoming a huge sales pitch?
Exactly. That influx of capital definitely fuels worries about commercial motives potentially overshadowing the science.
And circling back to David Nutt, his own commercial interests, like the alcohol substitute, advising those companies.
Yeah.
That fits into this sales pitch narrative for some critics, doesn't it?
It certainly can be seen that way. It just highlights how difficult it is to completely separate the scientific advocacy from the emerging commercial enterprise in this field.
Okay, let's talk about the really serious risks, the potential harms. We saw the tragic news about Matthew Perry's death involving ketamine.
Right. A terrible situation. And some argue that as access to these kinds of substances increases, even medically, we might unfortunately see more incidents like that.
Although the counter-argument there is that his situation involved kind of off-label use in a less regulated setting, maybe not the tightly controlled therapeutic model being proposed.
That's a fair point. It happened in what some call a semi-gray area without that full regulatory oversight. But the concern about misuse potential remains.
And then there was that huge study from Ontario, Canada, over 9 million people.
Yes, it's a massive population study, and it reported finding a 21-fold increase in the likelihood of schizophrenia among those who took psychedelics.
21-fold. That sounds incredibly alarming.
It's a staggering number, and it definitely demands very careful consideration and more research to understand that link.
And we touched on this earlier, but critics point out that even strong advocates like Nutt don't always seem to emphasize certain dangers sufficiently.
Right. Things like bad trips, even in safe environments, or those longer-term issues we mentioned, the anxiety, derealization, HPPD, which can last for months, years, even decades for some unlucky individuals.
And the point about increased suicidality in that one trial, and the response being maybe a bit quick to dismiss it.
Yeah, for those pushing for extreme caution, that kind of thing raises red flags about whether all potential negative outcomes are being taken seriously enough.
So this all feeds into the debate about regulation versus safety. Is regulation always the answer?
Well, some challenge that idea, right? They point to things like alcohol, tobacco, even legal marijuana markets.
Where legalization and commercialization haven't necessarily eliminated harms, sometimes maybe even created new ones, like super potent cannabis products, edibles everywhere.
Exactly. Things like 99% THC dabs or mass market gummies. So the question becomes, does regulation always make things safer? Or can the commercial pressures sometimes lead to, unintended negative consequences?
It's not a simple equation, but then what's the alternative, the current situation?
Well, that's the counterpoint. While criminalization doesn't necessarily mean everyone using mushrooms is in jail, the argument is that the current sort of free-for-all underground market, it's grown incredibly sophisticated, but operates with very little oversight. It's runaway, as some put it.
Because it's hidden. No visibility, no accountability.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So it's not just a simple choice between bad criminalization and perfect legalization. There's a whole messy reality in between.
Okay, so let's try to navigate this landscape. Regulation, ethics, public understanding. It's a lot. There's that strong argument you mentioned. Criminalization might actually be the loosest possible environment for drug use.
Yeah, the idea being that prohibition doesn't stop use, it just drives it underground, potentially increasing risks, which decades of evidence seem to support. People use substances anyway. The real question is how to make it safer.
Right, so the argument for regulation is that it can reduce risks.
By providing visibility, for one. Oversight, accountability structures. It allows for preventative measures, emergency support systems. Look at Oregon's program, for example. They reported only 5 emergency calls out of over 5,000 participants using the service.
That seems remarkably low.
It does suggest that a structured, supportive environment can manage risks effectively. And the medical framework, even if it doesn't capture the whole picture of mental health.
Meaning it's not just about brain chemistry.
Exactly. But that framework does allow for evidence-based scrutiny, establishing standards of care, things you just don't get in the unregulated underground.
So we see these different paths emerging for making psychedelics legitimate. There's the therapeutic or medical route, and then there's also advocacy based on religious freedom claims.
Right, 2 distinct approaches, which leads to a really critical question, I think. Is pushing the therapeutic angle mainly a strategy to eventually commodify these substances?
Like using medicine as the way in, but the end goal is broader commercialization. Is that maybe not the best way to truly legitimize them, ethically or culturally?
It's a real concern for some. They worry about repeating the marijuana playbook.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the pattern where you start with claims about medical use, which then gradually broaden to general access, maybe with very few real standards, and eventually it leads to full recreational legalization driven by commercial interests.
So a worry that the initial therapeutic intent gets lost along the way.
Precisely. Will the careful structured therapeutic model survive the pressures of a potentially massive market?
And tied into ethics, we have to address the sexual misconduct allegations that have come up.
Yes, that's crucial. It's important to be clear here, though. There seems to be a distinction often made. There was, reportedly, one well-known instance of an egregious sexual misconduct issue in an early MAP Slycos Phase 2 trial.
And that was reported and addressed publicly.
Yes. But then there are broader claims you hear about rampant misconduct. Some argue that that refers more to things happening with, quote, naturalistic users in completely unregulated underground settings, not the formal trials.
So distinguishing between issues within clinical trials versus the wider, less controlled scene.
Exactly. And proponents also point out, look, sexual misconduct sadly happens in basically every medical field. The psychedelic field, they argue, is aware of the specific vulnerabilities involved in this kind of therapy and is actively trying to implement safeguards.
It's definitely something that needs constant vigilance. Now, thinking about the public, how are people making sense of all this? There's been a real swing in media coverage, hasn't there?
Oh, yeah. Definite media whiplash.
Yeah.
For a long time, it felt like mostly positive hype. Lots of focus on these really powerful, often heart-wrenching stories of transformation.
Which maybe didn't fully prepare people for the complexities, the risks, the failures?
Quite possibly. Now we're seeing maybe a bit more balance or even a swing towards negative hype in some quarters.
It makes it hard for the public to get a clear picture. Look at that recent vote in Massachusetts.
Right. 57% of voters there rejected a measure for medical legalization of certain psychedelics.
Which was surprising, wasn't it? Given Massachusetts is generally seen as a pretty blue state and has that history with Timothy Leary and psychedelics.
It really was surprising to many observers. It suggests the public isn't just buying the hype wholesale. People are still sorting out the reality, trying to find that appropriate water level of information, moving past the old war on drugs hysteria, but also not blindly embracing everything.
And we have to remember the bigger context here. Mental health isn't just about, tweaking brain chemicals, is it?
Absolutely not. Many argue quite convincingly that mental health struggles are deeply tied to bigger societal problems. Things like isolation, economic inequality, injustice, even a sense of spiritual abandonment, as some put it.
Psychedelics alone aren't going to fix all that.
No. And it's interesting, historically, the major national mental illness organizations, they didn't really pour money into psychedelic research.
But that's changing now.
It seems to be shifting, yeah. More and more are getting involved, or at least interested, as the preliminary evidence has gotten stronger. However, it's worth noting the American Psychiatric Association's current official stance.
What is that?
They state that, as of now, there's still inadequate research for them to endorse psychedelics for treating psychiatric disorders across the board.
So still a cautious position from the main psychiatric body.
Very much so.
Okay. So for you listening, what's the takeaway here? I mean, it's clear you need to consider all these complexities, the trade-offs involved when we make public health decisions about powerful new treatments like these. There really are no easy answers.
No, there aren't. Ultimately, you've got this core tension, right? On one hand, this urgent, undeniable need for better mental health solutions. People are suffering. And on the other hand, you need that cautious, rigorous scientific approach. Validation, managing risks properly. Science needs to be dispassionate, objective, as free as possible from advocacy or commercial pressures. We really need more robust data before we roll these things out widely. Safety has to be paramount.
And yet, that suffering creates huge pressure. People need help now. And the argument is compelling that responsible regulation, done right, could unlock a genuinely powerful new approach and maybe even mitigate some of the risks we already see happening in the unregulated underground scene.
It's a powerful counterargument.
So it leaves us with this final thought for you to ponder. If the future of mental health does involve expanding our toolkit to include psychedelics, what is the right balance between that innovative hope and rigorous caution? And ultimately, who gets to decide where that line is drawn? Who bears that responsibility?